Maybe someone can confirm if that's gotten any better. I've killed that volume. Okay, perfect. Thanks, David. Apologies again. I'm not going to touch anything else, I promise. Leaving it like this. Sorry for whatever chaos that might have been. I can't wait to go back and hear what this sounds like after the fact. But appreciate everyone in the chat chiming in. It's going to be a learning experience for me to focus on my screen as I'm also watching the live chat. But again, I'm trying to make sure I'm encouraging audience interaction. So that's something I need to do anyway. So with that being said, I want to get back to Docmost. So right now I deploy software called Outline Wiki, and I really like it. Calls itself a knowledge base. I call it a wiki. I think that's how it refers to itself most of the time. It's very Notion-like, and admittedly, while Notion is hosted, I love the look of Notion, and I am a sucker for all of the documentation platforms that look like Notion. So if you've ever browsed my app directory, there are a ton of documentation and wiki and note-taking applications. And actually, David and I just talked about this on another broadcast earlier this week, that it seems it's an area that's saturated with platforms. But in particular, there are quite a few, or maybe a handful, that actually look and feel a lot like Notion. And I actually have a category for it here. And here you can see Docmost and Outline. And so Outline's great. I really enjoy it. And it's scratched all of the itches I have for the most part, but I've recently run into some other issues with it that have left me wanting more out of my documentation platform. And I'm going to come to their pricing, and I think it's here under self-managed. Their community edition, you can see it's limited. This is one of those pieces of software that if you're running the self-hosted or community version, they limit the functionality or capabilities that are available to you. And so in particular, and we'll talk about this, I think, once we get live with Docmost, workspaces are a big one for me. And then also the guest permissions, which would be right here, guest users. I have parts of my documentation that I like sharing with folks. Sometimes I like them to only have read-only access. Sometimes I like them to have editing access. And Outline doesn't really give me a whole lot of options with the self-hosted version. Just a week or two ago, I found Docmost has been on my radar for quite some time now, but Docmost had recently released an update. I think it would have been last week, where they've incorporated functionality for different workspaces, and that caught my eye when I was going through the newsletter and aggregating that and trying to put together all the updates. I noticed that and thought, hey, maybe it's time to look at one of these new platforms that's generating a lot of buzz. I've seen a lot of people talk about it, and I've heard a lot of people sing its praises. So I thought this would be a good opportunity, maybe to get some time with the community. Anyone else who might be looking for a documentation platform, we can do this together. I'm not sure that I'm necessarily willing to commit that this is what I'm using moving forward. But it looks great. It looks promising. I'm excited to spin it up. And more importantly, I'm excited to have functionality that isn't limited because I'm using the self-hosted or the community edition. So before I jump in, I have been trying to view the chat as I've been going. Kevin, thanks for the suggestion. I was actually going to hit this at the end of tonight's broadcast. More than happy to take suggestions or requests on future software you'd like to see deployed. Docmost, I think, is going to be fairly straightforward. I haven't deployed it yet. I'm doing this for the first time. Happy to try and also tackle some more complex ones if people want to walk through something like that together. I think I would probably put a limit on that. I'm not sure I would be willing to spin up an email server or anything of that complexity for anyone. At least for myself, I'm not sure I'm willing to tackle that, and it would probably be a several hour long broadcast. But I'm more than happy to take suggestions on other software, especially if it's something you've read in the newsletter, if there's an update or a new software launch that you're itching to try, but aren't quite brave enough to jump into it yourself. So with all that being said, let's go ahead. I'm going to jump in and we're going to start deploying Docmost. The goal is to install it tonight and play around with it a little bit, run through its features, its functionality within the interface, and then probably call it a night. I don't anticipate this taking a ton of time, but I'm going to take my time. I'm going to try and keep an eye on the chat. If anyone's following along, has any questions or runs into any issue, please feel free to throw something in the chat. If I can, I'm happy to help troubleshoot. And then, of course, maybe I'll need your help as well. So I'm on Docmost's homepage. I'm going to quit out of my other tabs there. And I'm going to jump to the documentation. By the way, when I aggregate content from my newsletter and when I look for new applications, I rarely navigate to project websites. I normally find their source code helpful, which is almost always GitHub, which is almost where I always start. And from there, I jump into the documentation. I think it's a really good habit. I think it is, I think it's super helpful, or I think more people who self-host should get into the habit of doing things like jumping into the documentation and reading source code pages, because GitHub is normally where they have things outlined. Because I think a lot of people get tripped up when they jump into just deploying applications right away as soon as they find something, jumping to the nearest Docker Compose file they can find on the website and trying to deploy it without really understanding what they're doing or what the various portions of the Compose file are. And so I always try and find the documentation and start from scratch, even if it's a piece of software that I say, hey, this looks really simple. I know I've deployed 5 million things like this before. I hate when I get tripped up and spend an hour or two trying to troubleshoot an error, only to go back to the documentation and say, hey, if I had read the documentation, I probably would have fixed that at the beginning rather than having wasted time on that. So, Kevin, I just noticed your other message. Thanks a lot, by the way. Appreciate the feedback, especially on Mastodon. I love interacting with people on the Fediverse. Super excited to start generating some relationships with some of the community as well. So feel free to keep the feedback coming. Okay, so from the introduction, I don't think I'm going to spend a whole lot of time here. I know what the features are from having read it in my newsletter, but again, it's really Notion-like. So think documentation and collaborative documentation. So a lot of people out there are deploying wikis or note-taking applications for their home lab. And many of them are single user instances. So you might not need functionality like what you're getting out of Docmost. But again, I'm looking at something where I can document the various aspects of my home lab and anything else I'm involved with, while also sharing them with others, but also not worrying about what I might and might not be sharing with others. And so Notion has them, Outline has them, but they're locked behind a paywall. And Docmost has them and they're not. They're called spaces, and they're a way to organize notes and documentation with some separation and some siloing. Excuse me. So with that being said, let's jump into the self-hosting menu and we'll start installing this right away. A couple different submenus here. I'm going to hop right into installation. So for now, documentation is telling us Docker is a recommended mode of installation. That's fine. I'm one of those people, I'd rather use Docker than bare metal, but I know from a survey that I'm currently slugging through the results that there are a lot of people who prefer bare metal. So it sounds like you can do that if you if you head over to this development guide. Maybe it has a few more steps that might be a little more complicated based on the fact that it's meant for developers at this point in time. But I'm going to go ahead with Docker. I'm going to scroll down to the installation steps. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this whole page. I'm going to make sure I understand what the full installation needs to look like for Docmost all the way through. And then I'll come back to the top and then I'll start working on deploying it myself. Again, I find that really helpful. Sometimes maintainers will document their projects and they'll throw stuff at the top. People start executing commands, only to realize there were more commands or subsequent commands that needed run either before or after. But because of the way the documentation was set up, that might not have been obvious, or it might have caused delays or pain when they were initially deploying it. So it looks like we're going to get a Docker Compose file, which I would expect for a Docker project. Looks like there's one on the GitHub page, but as my eyes are scrolling down the page, I also see that they've provided one here in the documentation. So hopefully I won't need to go to the source code to get that. Hopefully they keep this up to date. It looks like it's pretty straightforward. We have Docmost, a container for Docmost itself. It relies on Postgres and Redis. I am one of those people, and I know I get flack for this often in the communities I frequent. I maintain a shared database container for all of my databases. So instead of running a database instance for every application that requires it, I essentially have one master Postgres database that I use. And whenever I need to spin up a new application that requires a database and user, I'll go into Postgres's command line and I'll just create the username and password there. Happy to share that at some point if anyone's interested in doing something like that in the commands. I'm really, really anal about maintaining my infrastructure and backups. And so along with that, I also have really sound backup strategies for my databases as well. I run cron jobs that essentially run SQL dump commands nightly for every single database. So every time I add a database, rather than just doing a master dump, I will export each individually, and then I don't have to worry about some maybe relying on one database and another if I'm trying to upgrade or starting from scratch again. With all of that being said, I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm not going to assume everyone else who might be watching this either now or in the future does something similar, because I think more people use separate databases than use a shared database. So what I'll do when we come back to this is I'll just copy the entire compose file and we'll work off of this. So we have 3 containers, Docmost. We have Postgres here, and then we have our memory cache at the bottom. Looks pretty straightforward. Looks like there's some default variables and configuration that we're going to need to modify in the compose file before we go ahead and spin that up. Looks like there is an app URL, which is fine. I'm probably not going to attach it to a URL today. Probably because at least initially, I would probably use this on an internal domain that I don't think I'd quite have ready to spin up for this video. So hopefully it'll let me plug in something like HTTP, localhost, and whatever the port is. But we'll get to that when we get to it. Looks like we need to generate an app secret, and then we need a strong database password. I usually try and do something that's 12 to 16 characters with maybe a few symbols or special characters. And so I'll just randomly generate something when we get to that tonight. And then we'll just need to update the database URL with that password. To configure emails or file storage drivers, see the configuration doc. So like most applications, I'm assuming Docmost is going to need email for user management. So I'm not sure if it's going to be for users who are registering for the first time. And it looks like it also supports S3 storage. Default file storage is local. I'm going to stick with that for tonight. I'm not really interested in S3 at this point in time, but it's nice to know that it exists and the software supports it. So to start the services, we're going to run Docker Compose up. Once they're up and running, verify the installation by opening your web browser. Oh, okay, so it'll let me get there via local host rather than having to assign it to a domain right away. If all is set, you should see the Docmost setup page. Okay, perfect. So looks like when we first set up the application, we're going to be able to register for an admin account without having to go through all the email steps. I wasn't planning on configuring the email capabilities tonight. It looks like those are probably just going to be separate variables, or maybe we're going to get another configuration file at some point where we can address some of those. So I'm just going to keep reading and hope it comes to that configuration doc. Maybe we'll have to come back to that at some point as well. Excuse me. Okay. Here's some upgrade commands and then helpful Docker commands for people who might be new to Docker. If you mess something up, or if you don't want them running all the time for whatever reason, you can bring them down with Docker Compose down, or we're going to be able to restart them with Docker Compose restart if we need to make configuration changes. I'm looking at the chat here. Kevin saying it'll be great to talk about the security risk of containers, as most newcomers might expose them to the internet or it's not taking the necessary precautions. This is honestly probably an entirely separate video on best practices with Docker containers. Couple different things right off the bat. I guess I would say that I would encourage folks to do as they think about spinning up applications like this. First, when you're assigning a URL, definitely do not port forward anything. You do not want your router going straight to any Docker containers on your system. So we're going to expose, it looks like port 3000 for Docmost, and that's how we'll get to it internally. If you want to, if you would like to access this externally at any point, there are a couple different things you can do. You can spin up a VPN. You can deploy a reverse proxy, something like Traffic or Caddy, which would probably make for a good future video as well, something like a strong reverse proxy or maybe Nginx. And then the other thing I don't see here is I'm normally pretty strict about my Docker container networking. And so if you're not familiar with Docker, Docker can be configured to to create and isolate containers on their own Docker networks. And essentially what it does is it allows you to control which containers can speak with which other containers. And so for instance, Postgres is a really good example. I mentioned earlier that I often use a single Postgres database to manage my containers when I need database storage. I have a Docker network that is called Postgres, and no container has access to it unless they need access to that Postgres. Same thing with something like my reverse proxy. I run Caddy. I have a network called Caddy. A container only exists on Caddy if it needs access, if Caddy needs access for external access. There are probably even more secure things you can do than that. If you have all of your services in a single compose file, which a lot of people do, you could create something like a Docmost network where the Docmost container, the database, and the memory cache all sit on the same network, and nothing else can speak to it unless you explicitly state in your compose file that they can have access to that network. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to jump back up and we're going to get into the Docker compose file. So looks like we get this handy functionality to copy the Docker compose command, or the configuration for the Docker compose file. So I'm going to go ahead and click copy. I'm just going to use this as my template. I'm going to hop over to VS Code. I'm going to create a new, I'm going to create a new folder first. I'm just going to call it Docmost. And within there, I'm going to create a file called dockercompose.yml, and that's where we're going to store this Docker compose file that we found in Docmost documentation. So within here, I'm going to just copy and paste it. I'm going to click save. I'm probably going to click save 100 times because I have that muscle memory down and I do it regardless of changes. So if you see my cursor spinning, that's all that's happening. So let's run down the documentation again, and maybe I should just put these side by side and we can go down the list to make sure we're hitting everything that Docmost needs in order to deploy it. So you are to replace the default environment variables in the Docker compose file. We know we need to change the app URL. I'm running this on a local server on my network, actually on Debian. So I'm just going to replace that with my Debian host name. I usually do that just to make sure it's pointing at the right machine when I try to navigate to it after deploying it. If you want to assign an actual URL to it right away, if you're ready to spin it up and point to it in your reverse proxy, go ahead and do that here. Just make sure you enable HTTPS if you're using signed certificates, so you have that security as well. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to spin this up, and I'm probably just going to play around with it before I decide, hey, this is something I want to commit to and stick to. It looks like Nighthawk has spun it up and was shortly convinced that it was worth pursuing. So I hope we get to that. I also appreciate the note, Nighthawk, in your comment about no AI to fuss with or cloud hosting accounts. I know I'm one of those people, and I feel like I sound like a grumpy old man, but I love AI for certain purposes. But it does feel like we might be getting to a point where it's maybe making its way into places that I don't quite understand, and so it either bogs things down at times, or it feels like maybe development resources are going towards things that I don't know, might not be where the community or users want them to go. And so it is a breath of fresh air to come to a platform like this and say, okay, it hasn't been stricken with the AI bug yet. Maybe it will, and maybe at some point it should be, and AI will be super useful. But it's always nice to see that, at least from my perspective. I agree with that wholeheartedly. We have an app secret variable here that we do need to replace with something long and with something secret. So I'm going to do it on my live stream here so you can see it. Looks like they're going to give us a command to dump into our command line. So I'm just going to use that. It's a fairly common command if you generate secrets like this often. Just know if I decide to go with this, I will go back and regenerate my own secret that's not live streamed to the world. So let's go ahead and grab that. So I'm just gonna paste that into my terminal. I'm gonna get a nice long secret here. I'm gonna grab that. I'm gonna copy, and I'm gonna paste it into the app secret. Now, when we're talking about Docker security, going back to Kevin's note just a little bit ago, another thing people do, if you're not familiar with Docker, there are Docker secret file or their environment files where essentially, with Linux permissions, you can keep your secrets in separate files, and then you can change who has access to those files. So in this instance, I might have a separate file to store my app secret and my database password that I wouldn't want just any Joe Schmo to come into my server and be able to view. But once I do that, I probably don't care as much about people seeing the rest of my compose file because there's nothing sensitive here. So I might give this different permissions than I would give my password file. It's a really good practice to get into the habit of doing, because when you get into enterprise environments, you'll run into that, where you wouldn't keep secrets in the same place or in obvious production places. And also just because it's good practice, if somehow you don't follow great security practices, maybe you're forwarding ports that you shouldn't, and your system is compromised and people get access to your files. If you don't have your compose files locked down and you're keeping secrets in there, they'll be very easy for people to get at. I think that risk is usually pretty low, so I hate to bring it up like I'm a conspiracy theorist, but it is possible, and so I wouldn't want to shy away from making sure people are aware that that's a thing. So we've generated our app secret here. I think the last thing we need to do is replace our strong DB password in the Postgres container with our own password. And then after we do that, we'll just need to update the database URL in the Docmost containers configuration so that it can connect to Postgres once we change the password. So I am just going to type a bunch of letters in here because, again, I will probably go back and change this if I decide to stick with Docmost. But I'll give everyone else, I don't know, 20 or 25 seconds to come up with their own secure password. I would encourage you to use a mixture of characters, not just all caps like I'm doing. Again, this is just an example. Also, Nighthawk, I'm with you there. Proxy, proxy, proxy. I don't when I spin applications up in my home lab, I don't ever access anything through local ports. I isolate all my containers through Docker networks, and everything else gets proxied through Caddy. Some of them are externally accessible. Caddy is really nice because it has internal certs, which means I can use any domain I want, and I just have to install local certs on all the machines that I want to access those through. But it gives me flexibility and just gives me the peace of mind that I'm accessing things securely, even if I'm not accessing them externally. And then Canadian finance truths. I assume the app secret must be backed up. If you lose it, I assume you lose the Docmost data. Absolutely, you would need your app secrets backed up. I would assume you're probably backing up this entire folder, which would have your compose file, your app secrets, anything else that might come along with this. I like the platforms that are also accompanied by their own backup instructions. Usually I can piece together, digging through the volumes or folders that I've mounted for an application, what does and doesn't need backup. But I do really appreciate when developers and maintainers take the guesswork out of what needs to be backed up if you want to easily restore it in the future. Of course, the beauty of Docker is you just back up your volume and you can take it anywhere and then you can redeploy it. But some Docker containers also have heavy volumes with a lot of data that don't always need to be backed up. And so sometimes I hesitate to just blindly back up all of my Docker volumes and want to be a little more selective. But absolutely, on top of a secrets file, I would even encourage you maybe to look at deploying another tool to also manage or store your secrets. It could be as simple as a password manager. I deploy Vault Warden, and I use that a lot to store my secrets that I'll just refer to when I need to add them to my secrets file. There are also Vault programs that you can get to, that you can install. Some of them are feel a bit much for home lab environments, maybe geared or catered more towards enterprises and teams, business teams who are sharing secrets, but also something to consider. But again, even if you're using one of those tools, you'll also need to back those up as well. Okay, so I assume everyone's Postgres passwords have been generated. I'm going to copy mine. Again, I'm going to come up to my database URL. I'm going to replace the strong DB password with that password from down here. If I did not replace that, it would throw an error when I try to spin this up for the first time. And I think that is the last thing I need to do. Again, we're going to skip the emails and file storage driver because I'm not super interested in email right at this point in time. I'm assuming it's just a few environment variables that'll be very easy to go back and reconfigure. It doesn't look like we need it for the admin account, so I'm going to skip it. But I'm really quickly, I'm going to hop into the configuration options it gives us just to see. So we have, here are the mail variables. Looks like some folks might be using postmark. And then here are the S3 variables as well. Oh, okay, perfect. I don't know how I missed this in the menu to the left. There's actually a variables page itself. I wanted to see what else we could change to see if there's anything that might be interesting to change before we spin this up. So most of this looks straightforward. You know, the app URL, the app secret, which you know. So it looks like we can change the port that the application runs on. Not sure I would be super concerned with it. I think there are probably some legitimate use cases, but we can if there's a conflict locally, we can always change the port we're exposing without having to change the internal port. And as long as we have an individual or unique name for the container, when I would want to proxy this and add it and use and access it via another URL, I'll already have a unique string to give to Caddy because Docmost will be the only container on my Caddy network with the name Docmost. So Docmost 3000 should be adequate. Database configuration. This I was interested to see. I wanted to see if it was possible to use something other than Postgres. Usually, I feel like most applications come with SQLite by default and then allow you to update to either Postgres or MySQL. Looks like this does not, just uses Postgres by default. Here's the Redis stuff. And then it looks like we've already seen all of this before. Okay, perfect. So I think that's it then. I think we are ready to get things up and running. I'm going to come back here. I have some other things running on the server in the back end, so I'm anxious to see. I can't remember if I have something running on port 3000 off the top of my head. So I guess I'm going to find out if that's going to be a problem. But I'm just going to bring this up here. And again, it's giving us the Docker compose up command to run. If you're not familiar with Docker, this is what you can use. One thing to note, the -d flag here is to detach. If we don't include that, we're going to see all of the logs from the container, and we'll essentially be sitting in those container logs within the command line And I have to figure out a way to get out of there without also stopping the containers if we want to go ahead and do other things within the command line. Using the flag to detach that will just spin up the containers and then spit us right back to the command line so we can continue doing our thing. There are other ways to get to Docker logs if we want to or if we need to. I'm pretty confident that we're not going to need to do that tonight, but never say never. So with that being said, let's go ahead and spin this up. So again, I'm going to keep that up just so we'll have that for reference. So I'm just going to say, I'm sorry, my keyboard's off to the side here. I'm going to run Docker compose up. And of course, I am not in my Docmost folder. There we go. So in order to run your compose file, you need to be in the folder that has the compose file. So that was an awful mistake to make right off the bat. So here we can see it's pulling all of our containers. Looks like Docker's giving me a warning about version, which is no longer needed in my compose file. That's what Docmost gave us. I'm going to keep it in there. It's not going to hurt to have it at this point in time. And it looks like everything worked. So it created the volumes. This compose file came with volume mounts. So each, all the storage for these containers will be stored via their volume mounts. We can see those came through. And also the containers were created. So fingers crossed. Now if we navigate, now we should be able to navigate to Docmost in our browser. And here we go. Again, I think you can probably get there with either localhost or your server's IP and internal IP address and 3000, even if you set your app URL as something different, only based on the fact that it looks like they're doing that in the documentation as well. If they followed their own compose file, oh no, they did use HTTP localhost. I thought they may have been using something like this in the compose file, but they didn't. So okay, perfect. So I am in. It's allowing me to create my workspace. So I'm just going to type self-host. My name is Ethan Shawley. I'm just going to do let's deploy at self-host. Nice. Firefox is giving me my warning that I do not have a secure connection because I'm not proxying this at all. It does not have a signed certificate. So I'm going to get that error. I trust it. I'm not super worried about it. I'm looking at the chat here. That's a nice terminal. Is that a Mac? I'm actually on Windows 10 right now for various reasons. I'm happy to talk about it at a different time if anyone's interested. And it's actually Microsoft Terminal with the Dracula theme. I'm a sucker for dark themes and Dracula theme in particular. I'm just going to plug them because I plug them as much as possible. It's just like a nice dark theme for a million different applications. Every time I can, I deploy it. And so that's what you see in my terminal here. It's just Windows Terminal. I'm using SSH to get into my Debian server. And then from there, I'm executing all my commands. So super helpful. We are long past the days of needing something like PuTTY to get to Linux command line from Windows. This is natively built in and very nicely supported. Okay, so coming back to Docmost, I'm actually going to expand this because no one cares about my Visual Studio code anymore. And then again, I'm just going to, hey, this is Ethan. I'm not going to set a strong password because I'm probably just going to spin this up again if I decide to go to it. And so right off the bat, it looks like it created a general workspace for us. This is really nice. I'm encouraged seeing spaces you belong to, again, because I'm using Outline right now, and Outline does not allow me to use multiple spaces, and that is frustrating. So I guess let's just play around with the interface and see what we find. I'm sure there's probably a bit more in the documentation, but I typically rely on the documentation a little bit more to spin things up. I don't mind having to get my hands dirty, coming in and playing around. So it looks right off the bat, I have in my profile view in the top right, I have workspace settings. So here's probably where we can manage permissions. I have my account settings. Nighthawk, I see you made the comment about a dark mode in Docmost. I'm assuming that is probably in my preferences. Yep. So I clicked my profile, my preferences, and there is indeed a dark mode. Thank you very much. It's 9:30 at night where I am right now, and so I appreciate the dark mode. It's a little easier on my eyes. Looks like I could make changes to my account if I'd like to. I'm not going to change any of that. And then here are my workspace settings, and here's what I want. I want the ability to have members, but what I'm also interested in is potential permissions that will allow me to invite guests and then control what guests can do in any particular workspace or page. And maybe that's not possible, but here's also the point where we would create spaces. So let me just try this week. I can't type tonight. Self-hosted. Not sure what the slug is. I'm assuming it's just the slug in the URL. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So when I'm in a space, whatever you set for the slug is what appears in the URL. So if you want pretty URLs, make sure you update that. I'd be anxious to see if you can go back and change that, actually. Yeah, it looks like you can. Okay. I don't really care about that myself, so I'm going to hop out of that. And then, so this already feels very similar to Notion. It feels similar to Outline. It has everything organized in the collapsible menu on the left over here. And I said collapsible. I'm assuming it's collapsible. Yep, it is. So if we click this icon, we can collapse it if we're trying to work with something full page. Otherwise, we can bring this up over here, keep this up, and this is how we'll navigate around outside of any settings that you can get to through your profile up here. So overview, I assume, is where we were kicked when we came, or no, that would have been home, which will bring us a recap of all of the updated pages, I would think, across our spaces, not just in a single space. Again, general was default. I created this week in self-hosted. And this is exactly what I want. So in Outline, in the hosted version, in the enterprise version, you have the option to jump spaces. But in the self-hosted version, I don't have this. I am locked to a space at the left that just has the name of my space. I cannot change it. I cannot create new ones. Here, I can very easily go back and forth, which is absolutely what I wanted. I can add space members here. So it looks like we can add individual members. We can create groups of members, and then we can give them access to either completely manage the space, edit the space, or view the space only. We can delete the space. Okay, so I haven't run into guest permissions yet, but we'll try and get to that then. I think, so for something like Docmost, especially it's new, I think it's still being very actively developed. Obviously, they're adding stuff all the time because I feel like I feature it on my newsletter fairly often in the update section. But so there's not, aside from wanting to dig into the guest permissions, I don't think there's a whole lot more to dig into here, but that's okay because I wouldn't expect that at this point in time. It has the page functionality, which I'm gonna play with a little bit here. Looks like we can import. That's cool. Which I'll do here. Again, the emphasis, especially what people are looking for from something Notion-like or Notion clone, is the documentation and project management capabilities where you have these spaces. You have multiple spaces for different projects. You have pages for documentation, but they're also collaborative and they're built for collaboration. So you can see Docmost is clearly built for collaboration in mind because every menu we've hit has had some sort of permissions configuration. So do you want people to be able to manage this space? I wonder if it will get as far as pages, if individual pages will have permissions. It doesn't look like, but if you're new to something like this interface, this is where your documentation will live. So, you would give this a name up here, and then you can just essentially you should be able to nest pages. Yeah. So clicking the plus icon here will add pages down the left side, but you can also nest them if you hover over and you click this plus icon. So I'm assuming I can just nest to my heart's content. Yep. I don't know what instance I might need that level of nesting for my documentation. But I know I have at least 4 or 5 deep at some point. So, we could have something like, I don't know, if I'm keeping my notes in here, I can say, launches, Oh, this is nice. So if your nested notes, even if you nest something, you can still move it around and make it a parent or not a child of a specific one. So I can just drag and drop this where I'd like it to be. So we can say launches. We can say updates. I don't know how that shifted around there, but that's fine. Let's see, directory, apps. Yeah, this is perfect. Very nice. It's funny. It's letting me click on the bullet point there. I'm wondering if that's actually supposed to do something. If I'm missing something obvious. Okay, so you can import pages. This will be helpful for me. Outline lets me use Markdown to write my notes, and so my backup strategy, I use a custom script to actually export all of my notes via Markdown. So if and when I'm ready to move to Docmost, I can come in here and I can import all my pages, and I will not have to recreate them from scratch, which will be great because I have fairly robust documentation for a couple different things across my Hobe lab and just life in general. I document a lot of stuff. Let's jump into the space settings again. So we have members. Where were my... Okay, here we go. Here are the members. So it's not obvious to me. So I can invite members, and this is where the email configuration comes in when we were going through the compose file. This is where you would want that. I'm not sure. So it looks like when you create members, they'll be invited. They need to accept their invitation before they'll appear within the application. That makes sense. That seems sound to me. But what do I do if I just want to share a note with someone who's not logged in? Let me see if it talks about that in the documentation. We don't have a ton of documentation. Permissions management. I can't tell if I'm going crazy. Thought I had seen something at some point about guest access, but maybe not. Maybe for the time being, it's just robust permissions for users who are already registered within the application. This might need to be a post-video follow-up, but just for kicks and giggles. So if I copy the link here, if I jump into a private window where I'm not logged in, and I don't know why that didn't copy my link copied. Why did that not pick that up? Huh. That's interesting. I thought I was copying the link to this particular page. I must not be, or maybe it's... No, I'm actually not sure what I'm copying when I click that copy link. If anyone else is following along and knows what that copy is for, please let me know in the chat. I can see my URL is updating as I go from page to page. But I can't seem to, I'm not sure I understand what this copy link is for. Yeah, Canadian Finance Truth, I just saw your chat. I just checked my instance. I don't see a share page function either. It's interesting. So maybe, up here's another copy link. Huh. Maybe this is a bug report for the developer for this. The copy link does not seem to be doing anything. Copies the URL for the page itself. What's interesting is it's just not copying anything to my clipboard. Or I don't think so, at least. This looks like, I thought for sure this was the password I had configured for my, yeah, that's the password I was using for my Postgres database that's stored in my clipboard right now. Oh, Nighthawk, I see your comment. Okay, so Nighthawk is saying, I think that the copy option is disabled when you're on the local network. That probably makes sense because you're not sharing URLs externally if you're pointing to an internal network, although I'm not sure how it's detecting that I'm internal. Although Canadian Finance Truth is now saying it does work for you, so it's not necessarily that. So okay, I'm fine with that. That's definitely a follow-up. I certainly want to follow up with the developer about guest permissions, or maybe it's just a nice feature request. Or if someone else has the programming chops and wants to contribute to the project. I do not have them myself. I wish I could contribute in that way, but I cannot. And so here's the access. Okay, so Canadian Finance Truth is now saying you run yours through a reverse proxy. And yeah, I bet it's probably something like that. It is that I'm on my internal network and not running this through either HTTPS or something that has external access, and that's why I'm limited from copying. So I will spin something up after the fact, and I will make sure I check that out before I would submit any bug reports with the project. But with that being said, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to follow up on the guest access. That's huge for me. I just kicked off a new series on YouTube for my newsletter, This Week in Self-Hosted, where I am running through the newsletter each week in 30, 40-minute videos, and would love to rotate guest co-hosts every week. And I would imagine I would build my documentation for each show within something like Docmost. And I want the ability to share that with someone and either say this person can edit it or they can't edit it, but I want them to see it. And I don't want to necessarily have to register a user with them, because if I have a different guest every week for the entire year, that's going to be 52 new users that'll use this once and maybe never use it again. So, and Nighthawk, good point. It is probably worth noting that the copy URL does not work on local. So maybe if there's a way to detect that it is on local, to disable that functionality altogether. Again, I'm not picky. If that's what it is, and I think we figured it out, I would know not to use it. But it might not be intuitive. I don't know that I would have figured it out, honestly, if the chat hadn't chimed in here. So I'm grateful for that. But yeah, I think this is probably a good stopping point. I'm just going to monitor the chat for the next 30 seconds to see if anyone has questions about any other functionality or wants would like me to run through anything while we're live here. Otherwise, this seems pretty straightforward. We have the overview. You can search your pages. You have your settings for your multiple spaces. You have multiple spaces, which again, I cannot get enough of. I am very grateful for that. Also, I did see an option somewhere for, yes, there we go, full width pages. A lot of Notion alternatives force your screen to just like 6 inches in diameter worth of space for your documentation. And it just makes your documentation like really squished and long rather than filling up your screen. Most of them do have an option like this, but I have definitely come across some that don't. Page history, I think this may have been something that I recently added as well. This is really nice. Again, that's really important for collaboration. As I'm in here and looking at the options, it's very clear to me that the developer for Docmost had collaboration in mind, which is huge if you're trying to build something that's going to replace Notion for anyone in the future. And then it looks like you can add comments as well. So if you're working through pages with teams, you can highlight things, leave a comment, and let people come back and address that or chat about certain topics there to keep track of things. So with that being said, I am going to end this. Super appreciative of everyone who's joined along with me. I know this has been a little rough. Again, this is my first live stream ever, but I'm really grateful and appreciative of the interaction in the chat. Jilly, I see your note. My goal is to have this recorded and then posted on YouTube right away. And hopefully I've configured YouTube to do that right off the bat, so I don't have to I'm not going to try and edit this. I'm fine with it going raw. So hopefully it'll be here after the fact. I am also recording it locally just in the off chance that I did misconfigure YouTube. So if it's not up soon, I will put it up in the next day or so you can do that. Otherwise, I'm going to work on something in the next couple of days for maybe next weekend's deployment. Just as a more official way to try and capture feedback for what people want to see deployed in series like this. I have some things in my mind that I think would be cool to deploy. But again, I also want to help the community and contribute. So if there's something someone is struggling to deploy and you'd rather do it all of us together, I'm more than happy to schedule a series or an episode on that, and then we can run through all of that together. So I don't know if I'm sure there's self-hosted voting software out there that we can use, a polling software to start to gauge that sort of interest. But with that being said, thanks again, everyone. I really appreciate it. If you don't subscribe to my newsletter, that's okay. You can find it on my website, and you can subscribe via RSS if you don't want additional email. That's probably where I'll be communicating any notes about this series or making any announcements. So if you want to stay tuned, please just check that out throughout the week or every Friday when I post it. Otherwise, thanks again, and